Good day everyone. We are here to discuss the export subsidies. In this topic, we show how the countries and government allowing firms to lower cost and price and perhaps undercut foreign competition. Our topic to be reported is divided in 4 parts. Number 1, the introduction. Number 2, advantages and disadvantages. Number 3, effects on small and large countries. And lastly, the examples and graphs to us to further understand the export subsidies.
Export subsidies. Export subsidies include direct subsidies on export, losses of government trading firms in non-resident trade, and subsidies arising from various exchange rates on products and services that become payable to resident producers when the goods depart to the economic territory or when the services are supplied to non-resident units. It is a government policy that promotes the export of products while discouraging the selling of goods on the domestic market. It may take the form of direct grants, low-cost loans, tax cuts for exporter, or government-funded international advertising are all possibilities. Export subsidies are primarily intended to minimize imports while increasing domestic demand. Since the number of imports is reduced, the price of import rises, promoting domestic consumers to purchase more domestic products. In addition, an export subsidies would increase domestic prices while lowering foreign prices in the case of a large nation. A subsidy for export would increase the volume of exports. The export subsidy would create a price wedge between the international and domestic prices of the commodity equal to the subsidy amount.
Export subsidies have several advantages. Number 1, domestic employment. Because foreign imports are produced in other countries by foreign workers, subsidizing exports and increasing domestic production also increases domestic employment. Number 2, low foreign wages. Subsidizing the exports of domestic production compared to imports produced by foreign workers who receive lower wages. Number 3, infant industry. If foreign imports compete with a relatively young domestic industry that is not matured enough nor large enough to benefit from economies of scale, then export subsidies protect the infant industry while it matures and develops. Number 4, unfair trade. Foreign imports might be sold at lower prices in the domestic economy because foreign producers engage in unfair trade practices, such as dumping. Imports at prices below production cost. Export subsidies once again seek to level the competitive playing field. And lastly, the national security. Export subsidies can also encourage domestic production of goods that are deemed critical to the security of the national economy. Consumers will be encouraged to buy local products because they are more affordable. There are 2 key advantages to be emphasized in this part. Number 1 is the reduction in the cost of production for the businesses. Example of this, the Dairy Export Incentive Program, which pays cash subsidies to dairy exporters. It helped them to lessen the cost of business. Number 2, it increases the competitiveness of the company. Export subsidies in achieving an export expansion and diversifies the national economy towards the manufacturing of goods. To sum up, export subsidies is a government policy to encourage export of goods and discourage sales of goods on the domestic market through direct payments or government-financed international advertising.
Disadvantages of export subsidies. Number 1, shortage of supply. One of the advantages of export subsidies is to increase the supply, but increasing the supply can result in lowering the prices. Lowering the prices can lead to the sudden rise of demands that can cause shortage. Shortage plus rise in demands can cause in the increases of price. Number 2, higher taxes. The government funds for export subsidies came from the taxes imposed to the general population, businesses, and corporations. Visualize it. In accordance to World Trade Organization Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures in 1996, Article 27.5, that export subsidies can be phased out in 2 to 8 years in developing countries members. In the case of 80 years, those are countries under the Annex 7 of Agreement, where the GNP per capita is $1,000 per annum, like the country of Bolivia, Dominican Republic, Egypt, Ghana, Guatemala, Philippines, etc. Funds for 2 to 8 years are being funded by all taxpayers, which to enable to support them, higher taxes is imposed. Number 3. Export subsidies can be misused and abused. The export promotion schemes are often complex, and this leaves them open to misuse and abuse. As an example is the Argentina during the 1980s reimbursement for export produced with sugar. All costs are being reimbursed from the start of shipments, defaults or exports, from the exports of new markets, and other costs are being reimbursed, but the tax reimbursement claims are however for the entire value of output only, which means they are funded more, but claims are lesser. Lastly is the export subsidies are illegal under the WTO regulation because they can trigger retaliatory action from the trading partners, misaligned prices, dependence in subsidies, and distort the allocation of resources. Yet, the impact is small while its direct fiscal cost for keeping them in place can be unjustifiably large. That's why during 2015 in Kenya for 10th Ministerial Conference of WTO, the minister adopted the Nairobi package. They decide that members of developed countries will eliminate their remaining export subsidies entitlements. Members for developing countries will eliminate their export subsidies entitlements in 2018, but marketing and transport for agriculture export will be end at 2023. And the poorest of food importing countries will provide additional time to comply with the decision.
Next, I will discuss about the effects of export subsidies on small countries, also known as home country or domestic country. Then the first one is it will increase the domestic price while it lowers the consumer surplus. So it is all about when export subsidies apply the value of money in each unit. It will increase the price in home country because of surplus brought by export subsidies. In continuation on the effect of number 1, the domestic price increase. So the similar product will also increase their price. So in result, the suppliers of both product will enter to a surplus. Next is about export affects national welfare of a small country, especially when there is a higher tariff, which affect home country or small country due to the incurring of expenses that will decrease the profit of small country's exporter. Last would be in case of tariff, there will be a deadweight loss. It is composed of producer's loss and consumer's loss. It happens due to the transfer of goods in a lower prices than the pre-trade. Why? Because in small country, to be able to compete with the large country, they need to lower their prices to buyers to accept their product, which brought them losses that is called deadweight loss.
Effects of export subsidies in large countries. First, an export subsidy lowers consumer surplus and raises producer surplus in the exporter market. Consumers of the product in the exporting country experience a decrease in well-being as a result of the export subsidy. The increase in their domestic price lowers the amount of consumer surplus in the market. Producers in the exporting country experience an increase in well-being. The increase in the price of their product in their own market raises producer surplus in the industry. The price increase also induces an increase in output, an increase in employment, and an increase in profit, payments, or both to fixed costs. Second, an export subsidy raises consumer surplus and lower producer surplus in the import country market. Consumers of the product in the importing country experience an increase in well-being as a result of the export subsidy. The decrease in the price of substitutes increases the amount of consumer surplus in the market. Producers in the importing countries suffer a decrease in well-being. The decrease in the price of their product on the domestic market reduces producer surplus in the industry. The price decrease also induces a decrease in the output of existing firms, a decrease in employment, and a decrease in profit payments are both to fixed costs. Lastly, national welfare in the importing country rises when a large exporting country implements an export subsidy. The aggregate welfare effect for the country is found by summing the gains and losses to consumers, producers, and the government. The net effect consists of three components: a positive terms of trade effect, a negative production distortion, and a negative consumption distortion. Although there are both positive and negative elements, the net national welfare effect reduces to area which is positive. This means that an export subsidy implemented by a large exporting country in a perfectly competitive market will raise national welfare in the importing country.
To further understand what is export subsidy in small countries, here is an example. For the graph, P stands for price, Q stands for quantity, S stands for supply, D stands for demand, A is for equilibrium of the demand-supply curve, PW is world price, Q1 is the demand above the equilibrium of the demand-supply curve, and Q2 is the supply above the equilibrium of the demand-supply curve. The distance between Q1 and Q2 is the original exports. PW plus S is world price plus the subsidy, which means in every unit that will be sold in the international market, there will be an extra check or payment from the government. For example, the price of a product is $100 and the government is willing to pay $10 to every unit that will be exported. Every time a domestic firm sells a product, they will get $100 from the international markets plus $10 from the government. That clearly shows the benefit of the subsidy. However, it also affects the increase in domestic price because of the subsidy. As a result, because of the higher price of sales at domestic and international markets, there will be a decrease in domestic consumption, which is the Q3. And the Q4 is the indication of the increase in the amount produced. The distance between Q3 to Q4 will be the new exports and it expanded because of the subsidy.
A new subsidy rate in equilibrium will be reached when the two following conditions are satisfied. PSUS equals to PS max plus S and XSUS times PSUS equals to MD max times PS max, where S is the specific export subsidy, PS max is in the price in Mexico after the subsidy, and PSUS is the price in the United States after the subsidy. The first condition represents a price wedge between the final US price and the Mexican price equal to the amount of the export subsidy. The price must differ by the subsidy because US suppliers of wheat must receive the same price for their product, regardless of whether the product is sold in the United States or Mexico, and all wheat sold in Mexico must be sold at the same price. Since a subsidy is paid to US exporters, the only way for those price equalities within countries to arise is if the price differs across countries by the amount of the subsidy. The second condition states that the amount the United States want to export as its new higher price must be equal to the amount Mexico wants to import as its new lower price. The condition guarantees the world supply of wheat equals world demand for wheat. The export subsidy equilibrium is depicted graphically in the figure. The Mexican price of wheat falls from P-wheat to PS max, which rises to import demand from QFT to QS. The Mexican price of wheat falls from PFT to PS max, which rises to import demand from QFT to QS. The US price of wheat rises from P-wheat to PSUS, which raises its export supply. Also QPT to QS, the difference in the price between the two markets is equals to the export subsidy rate S.
One of the example of export subsidies to large countries is the United States. It is the exporting country in free trade. It implements a specific export subsidy on exports of wheat. A subsidy to exports will encourage the flow of wheat across the border. So, it will now cost less to move the product from the United States into Mexico. The graph shows that the supply of wheat to the Mexican market will rise, causing a decrease in the price of wheat. Since the United States is assumed to be a large country, the price of all wheat sold in Mexico, both Mexican wheat and US imports, will fall in price. The lower price will raise Mexico's import demand. The higher wheat supply to Mexico will reduce supply in the US market and induce an increase in the US price. The higher price will raise US export supply.